There is a moment in the Gospels that has troubled careful readers for 2,000 years, not because it is morally disturbing, not because it contradicts other scripture, but because it seems, on the surface, simply unfair. A man walks up to a tree, hungry, looking for something to eat. He finds nothing on its branches, and then he curses it. By the next morning, the tree is dead from its roots. If that were the whole story, we might be tempted to move on quickly, filing it away as one of those difficult gospel passages best left to the scholars. But the story does not end there, and it was never meant to. Because the man walking up to that tree was not merely a hungry traveler, he was the Son of God. And the tree was not merely a tree. The episode is recorded in two places, in Matthew 21:18-22 and in Mark 11:12-25. And already between those two accounts, we encounter something theologically electric. Mark, writing with his characteristic attention to sequence and detail, tells us something Matthew does not. He tells us, with what almost feels like an editorial aside, that it was not the season for figs. And seeing a fig tree afar off having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon, and when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet, as Mark 11:13 records. Matthew moves more quickly past the detail and cuts to the effect. By the next morning, the disciples see the fig tree withered away from its roots. But Mark, who according to the earliest patristic tradition recorded Peter's eyewitness preaching, slows down enough to make sure we notice that Jesus cursed a tree for lacking fruit that it was not even supposed to have yet. The apparent unreasonableness of this act is not a flaw in the text. It is, rather, the entire point. To understand what is happening, we need to step out of our modern Western context and step firmly into the world of first-century Judea, where trees were not merely vegetation, where seasons carried covenantal weight, and where prophetic action was a recognized and honored mode of divine communication. The fig tree, in the Hebrew scriptural imagination, was not just a fruit-bearing plant. It was a symbol of national identity, of covenant blessing, and of the spiritual condition of Israel as a whole. When Moses sent spies into Canaan, they returned carrying pomegranates, grapes, and figs, as recorded in Numbers 13:23, because these were the tokens of the promised land's abundance. When the prophet Micah envisioned the age of messianic peace, he described it as every man sitting under his vine and under his fig tree, none making him afraid, as in Micah 4:4. When the prophet Jeremiah received a vision of 2 baskets of figs placed before the temple of the Lord, one basket filled with good figs and one with rotten ones, God used that image to distinguish between those who would respond to his discipline in exile and those who would not, as told in Jeremiah 24:1-10. And when the prophet Hosea recorded God looking back on Israel's early devotion, the tenderness was rendered in agricultural terms. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time, as in Hosea 9:10. The fig tree was bound up with Israel's identity, her promise, and her calling before God. The fig tree was Israel. Everyone who heard Jesus that morning would have understood this without being told. The symbol was woven into the fabric of the Hebrew prophetic tradition so deeply that to curse a fig tree in public dramatically as one approached Jerusalem was to say something unmistakably loud about the spiritual condition of the nation. But the act alone is not enough to interpret. We need to know what Jesus was doing in those days, where he was going, and what he was looking at, because the cursing of the fig tree does not stand alone. Mark deliberately sandwiches it between 2 visits to the temple, and this literary structure, a technique called intercalation, which Mark uses repeatedly throughout his gospel to invite the reader to interpret one story through the frame of the other, is itself the exegetical key. On the day before the fig tree incident, Jesus had entered Jerusalem in what we call the triumphal entry, riding on a donkey's colt in deliberate fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9. While the crowd spread cloaks and branches on the road before him and cried out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Blessed be the kingdom of our father David, that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest," as in Mark 11:9-10. Then the text tells us something easily overlooked. Jesus entered the temple, and when he had looked round about upon all things, and now the eventide was come, he went out unto Bethany with the 12, as in Mark 11:11. He surveyed the temple courts, he saw everything, and he left without doing anything that evening. The next morning, on the way back into Jerusalem, he cursed the fig tree. And when he arrived at the temple, he drove out the money changers and the sellers of doves, overturning their tables, citing Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11 as his authority. "Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves," as in Mark 11:17. The fig tree and the temple are one parable. The religious establishment in Jerusalem, like the fig tree, displayed all the external signs of life. There were leaves, an abundance of them. The temple courts were full of activity, of commerce, of priests, of sacrifice, of the whole apparatus of organized religion. There was the appearance of devotion, the structure of covenant faithfulness, the visual testimony of a nation that still worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet, just as the fig tree bore leaves without bearing fruit, the temple had become a house of transaction rather than transformation, a market rather than a meeting place between heaven and earth. The outer show was magnificent. The inner reality was hollow. Now we must return to the detail that Mark gives us and that so many readers have stumbled over. It was not the season for figs. How could Jesus justly curse a tree for lacking fruit out of season? The question, though sincere, actually misunderstands what is happening botanically and, more importantly, symbolically. Palestinian fig trees in the spring, before the main harvest in late summer, typically produce what is known in Hebrew as pagim, the small, early green figs that appear alongside the very first leaves of the season. This is the word used in Canticles 2:13, where the Beloved says, "The fig tree putteth forth her green figs," the pagim, as a sign that winter is past and the season of new life has come. The pagim and the leaves grow out together. Where there are leaves, there ought to be pagim. Where there are pagim, there will eventually be a full harvest. The two are bound together in the natural order of the tree's life. This is why Mark's detail, "for the time of figs was not yet," does not exonerate the tree, it explains it. The main crop was indeed not yet ready, but the pagim, the early fruit that always accompanies the first leaves, should have been there. When Jesus approached the tree and found leaves in abundance but no pagim at all, he was not disappointed that summer had not arrived in spring. He was confronting a tree that was making a promise it could not keep. The leaves announced readiness. The absence of even the earliest fruit revealed that the tree was, at its root, barren, incapable of producing what its outward appearance advertised. It was not that the tree had failed to do the extraordinary, it had failed to do the ordinary. The outward sign was present, the inward reality was absent. What looked alive was, in the truest sense, already dead. This distinction is crucial because it exonerates Jesus of any charge of unreasonableness, while simultaneously sharpening the theological edge of the act. He was not demanding a December harvest from a March orchard. He was expecting what the tree's own outward condition advertised, and he found nothing. The leaves had made a promise that the roots could not keep. And this, more than anything else, is the spiritual anatomy of religious hypocrisy, as Jesus encountered it throughout his entire ministry. A promise made by outward form that the inward reality cannot honor. This is precisely what Jesus was proclaiming about the temple establishment, and by extension, about the religious leadership of Israel in that hour. The Pharisees and the chief priests bore the leaves of religious observance, elaborate tithing practices, public prayers, ornate vestments, a meticulous system of ritual purity that governed every aspect of daily life. But when the Messiah himself came looking for fruit, for justice, for mercy, for love of God that overflowed into love of neighbor, for a people ready to receive their King, he found nothing, not even the early fruit that precedes the full harvest. And so the curse he pronounced over the fig tree was also a prophetic pronouncement over the religious structure of his nation, one that would find its most devastating fulfillment in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Roman armies in 70 AD, an event Jesus himself prophesied explicitly in Mark 13:1-2 and Luke 21:5-6. We must be careful here, however, because the text will not allow us to stop with a historical judgment on first-century religious leaders alone. Jesus was not simply declaring that the Old Covenant system had run its course. The context of the temple cleansing deepens the lesson considerably. When Jesus cited Isaiah 56:7 in full, "My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer," he was pointing to a vision that the temple was always meant to embody, but had failed to realize. The house of God was designed to be a place where the nations, the outsiders, those without Jewish genealogy, could come and encounter the living God. The court of the Gentiles, the one section of the temple complex where non-Jews were permitted to enter and draw near in prayer, had been converted into the very marketplace Jesus was overturning. The one space reserved for those who were spiritually hungry but stood outside the covenant community had been occupied by commerce. The leaves were everywhere. The fruit, the welcoming of all peoples into the presence of God, was nowhere. We need to feel the weight of this. Jesus was not performing a miracle of destruction for its own sake. He was making visible what was already invisible but spiritually real. The fig tree was already, in the deepest sense, dead, not because he cursed it, but because it had failed at the most fundamental level of its purpose. His words simply made the invisible reality manifest in the visible world, in the same way that his words over Lazarus in John 11:43-44 did not create life from nothing, but called forth what God had already ordained. When he spoke to the fig tree, he was standing in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets who regularly performed enacted parables, visible physical acts that proclaimed an invisible spiritual reality. Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign of coming captivity, as in Isaiah 22:3. Jeremiah smashed a potter's vessel in the valley of Hinnom as a prophetic declaration of judgment upon Jerusalem, as in Jeremiah 19:10-11. Ezekiel lay on his left side for 390 days and his right side for 40 days to embody the years of Israel's and Judah's iniquity, as in Ezekiel 4:4-6. Jesus, standing in that same prophetic lineage while infinitely surpassing it, cursed a fig tree in the sight of his disciples, and the meaning was as unmistakable to anyone with ears to hear as Jeremiah's shattered vessel had been to the elders of Jerusalem. What is especially striking about Jesus in this moment is that he himself bore the full cost of everything his enacted parables proclaimed. When he spoke of the temple being destroyed and raised in 3 days, as recorded in John 2:19-21, he was speaking of the temple of his own body. When he wept over Jerusalem in Luke 19:41-44, saying that her enemies would dash her children to the ground because she did not know the time of her visitation, he wept as one who bore that rejection personally and redemptively. And when he cursed the fig tree, he was not pronouncing judgment from a position of cold detachment. He was, within the same week, about to stretch out his arms on a Roman cross and bear in his own body the full weight of the fruitlessness and failure that the fig tree represented, so that everyone who comes to him in genuine faith might be, as Paul writes in Romans 11:17-24, like a branch grafted into a cultivated olive tree, drawing life not from their own root, but from his, and bearing fruit they could never have produced on their own. It is worth pausing on the disciples themselves for a moment, because they are the immediate audience for this entire episode, and their response tells us something important. Peter, in Mark's account, was startled enough the next morning to point out the withered tree as though it were a remarkable curiosity. "Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursedst is withered away," as in Mark 11:21. The Greek word used in verse 20 to describe the tree is exarantai, dried out from within, drained of its vital moisture, dead at the cellular level. Peter saw the completeness of the judgment and marveled, but Jesus did not let the disciples linger in amazement at a miracle of destruction. He immediately redirected their attention toward what the miracle was meant to produce in them, not admiration at divine power over vegetation, but a deeper personal encounter with what it means to live and pray in genuine rooted faith. "Have faith in God," he said, as in Mark 11:22. And then, "For verily I say unto you, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith," as in Mark 11:23. And he closed with a word about forgiveness. "And when ye stand praying, forgive, if ye have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses," as in Mark 11:25. This movement in the text is not accidental, and it is not a change of subject. It is the culmination of everything the cursed fig tree was meant to teach. The tree that bore leaves without fruit was the emblem of religion without reality, of external performance without internal transformation, of the appearance of life without the living root of genuine faith. And what is the living root? What is the internal reality that produces true fruit? It is exactly what Jesus named in those verses: faith in God, a faith that does not merely acknowledge God's existence, but genuinely trusts His power, His word, and His promises enough to pray in accordance with them. It is the kind of faith that is inseparable from a forgiving heart, because a heart that has truly received the mercy of God cannot withhold mercy from others without revealing that it has not, in fact, encountered that mercy at all. Fruit and root belong together. The fig tree had neither, but the appearance of both. The Apostle James, writing to a community of Jewish believers who would have known the fig tree's significance well, pressed exactly this point when he wrote that faith without works is dead, as in James 2:17. He was not contradicting Paul's insistence that justification is by faith alone, as Paul himself argues clearly in Romans 3:28 and Galatians 2:16. He was saying what Jesus enacted at the fig tree. The true, living faith produces fruit as naturally and inevitably as a healthy tree produces its harvest. It cannot fail to produce fruit. A faith that is genuinely rooted in the living God will express itself in the things of God, in love, in mercy, in justice, in generosity, in prayer, in the transformation of character that Paul catalogued as the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22-23. If none of these things are present, if all that exists is the religious leaf, the outward sign, then the root has a problem that goes far deeper than the season. There is a question that presses against us here from the inside, and it will not be satisfied with a purely historical answer. It is the question every honest reader of the Gospels must eventually face. Am I the fig tree? Do I bear leaves The visible signs of Christian identity, the vocabulary of faith, the attendance at worship, the participation in religious community, while something essential is absent at the root. This is not a comfortable question. It is not meant to be. Jesus was not a comfortable teacher. He did not curse the fig tree to shock the disciples into submission, but to awaken them to a spiritual reality that was already present, and that, if left unaddressed, would produce the same outcome in any life that it produced in that tree. A withering from the roots outward, a death that begins invisibly and becomes undeniable. What Jesus was looking for at the fig tree, he is still looking for, not perfection, not a complete harvest all at once, not even the full, ripe fruit of mature discipleship. He was looking for evidence of life, the pagim, the early fruit, the first sign that genuine growth was happening, that the root was alive, that when the full season came, there would be something real to show. The early fruit is, in the life of a believer, the evidence of a heart genuinely turned toward God, not a performance crafted for others to observe, but the unforced, natural overflow of a soul that has truly encountered the living Christ and been changed from the inside out. The season matters here too, and in a way that brings unexpected hope. Jesus cursed the tree, not because it lacked the late summer harvest, that would have been unreasonable by any measure, but because it lacked even the early fruit that its own leaves demanded. There is grace built into God's expectations. He does not demand from his people a maturity they have not yet had the time to develop. He does not look upon a young believer and condemn the absence of the theological depth that comes from decades of walking with him. But he does look, in every season of a life, for the fruit that that season is capable of producing. The believer who displays genuine repentance, genuine hunger for the Word of God, genuine love for the community of faith. That is early fruit. It is real, it is living, it is what the season demands, and it is enough. The story of the cursed fig tree is, at its deepest level, not primarily a story about judgment. It is a story about authenticity. It is an urgent, tender, searching word from a Savior who knows the difference between leaves and fruit, between religious performance and living faith, between the appearance of devotion and its reality. He walked up to that tree because he was hungry. And throughout the Scriptures, his deepest hunger was for the transformation of human lives, for the fruit of obedience and love that glorifies the Father. He himself said in John 15:8, "Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples." And in John 15:16 he made the divine initiative plain. "Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you, that ye should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain." This is not a call to religious performance. It is a call to abide, to remain in him as branch in vine, drawing life from his life and bearing fruit not by human striving, but by genuine union with the living Christ. And there is one more layer that we cannot pass over in silence. Jesus cursed the fig tree and then spoke about faith and prayer in the same breath, and the connection is not incidental. The antidote to being a fruitless fig tree is not greater religious effort. It is not more leaves. It is not a more rigorous performance of external devotion. The antidote is genuine, rooted, persistent prayer, the kind of prayer that comes from a heart that actually believes God is real, that his promises are true, that the mountain can move, and that the one praying is in living relationship with the one being prayed to. Prayer is the evidence of the root. It is what a soul does when it has genuinely encountered God and knows that apart from him, it can do nothing, as Jesus himself said in John 15:5. This is the fruit. This is what was absent from the temple courts, where prayers had become professional obligations and worship had become a commercial enterprise. And this is what Jesus was inviting his disciples, in the most dramatic terms available to him, to choose for themselves. What Jesus was pointing to in his teaching on prayer was not a technique for getting things from God. It was a description of what genuine relationship with God looks like from the inside. Prayer, in the biblical sense, is not the religious equivalent of placing an order. It is the natural breath of a soul that is alive to God, that has nowhere else to go, that has found in the living God the source and sustainer of everything it is and hopes to be. The disciples who watched the fig tree wither were being shown what happens to a life that has lost that breath, that has the form of religion without the living connection that makes religion real. And they were being invited in the same moment to become something the fig tree could never be, genuinely alive, genuinely rooted, genuinely fruitful, because genuinely connected to the one who is himself the resurrection and the life, as he declared in John 11:25. The fig tree withered from its roots. The roots are where the life is or is not. Everything visible, every leaf, every branch, every outward sign draws from what is below the surface. If the root is alive in genuine faith, genuine surrender, and genuine love for God and neighbor, then the fruit will come. It cannot be stopped. But if the root is merely the inherited religion of one's culture, the comfortable habits of a community, the social benefits of belonging to a worshipping group, then the leaves will appear and the tree will look from a distance like something healthy, and the searching eyes of the Son of God will find nothing when they look more closely. This is the word that the cursed fig tree speaks across 2,000 years to every person who has ever called themselves by the name of Christ. It is not primarily a word of condemnation. It is a word of invitation, urgent, clear, and delivered with the full authority of the one who, 3 days after the temple controversy and the withered tree, rose bodily from the dead to prove that his words are never empty and his promises are never hollow. He was not looking for the impossible. He was looking for the real. And the real, the early fruit, the evidence of genuine life, is available to every soul that comes to him and abides in him, as he said in John 15:4-5. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me. Tell us in the comments where you are watching or reading from today. And take a moment to ask yourself honestly, is my root in him? What fruit is this season of my life producing? We would love to hear from you.